Thank you. So today marks another year in the revolutionary struggle of the Egyptian people against the structures of Mubarak's regime, the Brotherhood's government, and the military. The revolution's demands are bread, freedom, and social justice, none of which have been accomplished through the transitional period and the current government. It's not due to the lack of organizing, mobilizing, or the steadfast to uphold the revolutionary principles, but it is because of the musical chairs that have been played throughout the course of the last 2 years. Last 2 years of the old regime loyalists re-entering into the political domain, the demonization of the media, the continued police state, and the public opinion being shifted into petty issues or large public opinion polls like the elections and the referendums. Hence, the revolutions have high and low points, internal and external factors that have to be contextualized to their economic and political and social standings. The question in most media outlets, Western and non-Western media outlets, was what if the Brotherhood took over Egypt, and how would Egyptian society would look and function? Hence, the characterization of Morsi's government is to put in place. During Mubarak's rule, the Muslim Brotherhood was considered a banned organization due to the technicality as a religious organization. The Brotherhood ran as independent candidates in parliamentary elections, and during the early years of the revolt, the supreme guidance of the Muslim Brotherhood office claimed that they were not participating in the revolt. It was only after a few days within the sit-in in Tahrir Square when the Brotherhood officially joined the square. Immediately after Mubarak's ouster, the Muslim Brotherhood began to hold talks with the military council. The Muslim Brotherhood ran Mohammed Morsi as a candidate with his project as known as the 100-Day Project or the Renaissance Project, which has been proven a big failure, as a matter of fact. The 10-point document promised better pay, healthcare, better administrative systems, and within 100 days of his presidency, he will guarantee security within the country, cleaning up the streets from garbage, establishing an effective garbage system, and cleansing the ministries from former regime loyalists, just to name a few. After his constitutional declaration, we can assess what has been going on in the country. So, freedom of association. Before January 25th, 2011, there were only 3 independent syndicates, union syndicates. And after the revolution, labor strikes were staged in high numbers and in large frequencies. And 1,200 syndicates were formed in the public and private sector, as well as independent labor unions for government workers and street vendors. Still, the Trade Union Law 35 of 1976, which restricts workers' rights from forming independent union, has still been a major obstacle for labor activists. Moreover, Manpower Minister Khalid al-Azhari has ignored the demands of the workers for both public and private sector workers, and never invited workers to meetings that concerned workers' rights. Most importantly, the demand of the establishment of a national minimum wage of £1,200 has not yet been met. The freedom of assembly. Under the Military Council, a law was passed in March of 2011 which criminalized strikes, protests, demonstrations, sit-ins that would disrupt private and state-owned businesses. With Morsi's declaration, a maximum of 1 year prison sentence and up to a fine of £500,000 will be sentenced for any disruptions. In December 2012, under the Brotherhood government, anti-protest laws was introduced, which stated that protests can only be held between 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. with proper permits from security forces and without making controversial slogans. In other words, emergency laws are being implemented. It is expected this law to be reintroduced after the election of a parliament in February. Freedom of belief. Article 2, as Selma mentioned, of the Constitution states, quote, that the principles of Islamic law are the primary source of legislation, which have been around since 1971, but most problematic with the addition of two other articles in the Constitution. The first article is Article 219. States that the principle of Islamic law will lay the foundation of civil laws and through the general rules and prudence under the school of thought of Sunnism, which many believe it is a clear bias towards Shiism, Sufism, and the Coptic community. The second one, Article 43, states that only divine religions will be recognized, which is Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, which leaves out the Baha'is of Egypt. The other thing is the insulting of the president. Insulting the president lawsuits have risen during Mubarak's the past 6 months in power, which exceeds those filed under all Egyptian rulers since 1892, according to the Arab Network for Human Rights Information. A total of 24 lawsuits for insulting the presidents have been filed against journalists and activists since his election. Only 2 have been ruled upon by court, however. The other thing is the economy of Egypt. Egypt has been suffering an economic recession as much as the world has. The common sentence on the tongues of the Egyptian workers are that we want to live, we want the production wheel to move so that we can live. Egypt requires more than $20 billion a year to simply meet its basic needs. Egypt's foreign exchange reserves plummeted below what economists called critical minimum. And the Egyptian pound is currently sinking, and the country is cutting essential imports like oil. State-owned company Egyptian General Petroleum Corporation has only purchased 3 million barrels of crude oil for the first quarter of this year, which is considered half and insufficient to supply Egypt's refineries. On December 28, 2012, Ahram Online reported that 15 Egyptian power stations, more than a tenth of the country's power capability, stopped generating power. Morsi's government has taken the same path of the neoliberal policies of Mubarak, which is reliant on the West for foreign loans. EU President Herman van Rompuy, along with Senators John McCain and Lindsey Graham, were in Cairo last week. The EU promised $6.7 billion in loans and investments as long as Egypt signs an agreement with the IMF. Egypt's trade deficit runs at an annual rate of $42 billion as of November 2012. In accordance with the IMF, to receive $4 billion in loans with additional other loans from the IMF, Egypt has to cut its budget deficit over 8.5%, from about 15% almost entirety by reducing energy and food subsidies. The Egyptian pound has lost about 10% of its value during the last month alone. Morsi was not only looking at the West for loans, but from the Arab Gulf states such as Qatar, Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia. Qatar lent Egypt $2.5 billion in December. In exchange, Egypt would buy natural gas from Qatar at inflated prices. Food security in Egypt still remains an imagination for the vast majority of Egyptians. Food protests have continued after the uprising, with the inflation reaching new peaks. Egypt's poverty rates increased to 25.2% of the population in 2010-2011, compared to the 21.6% 2008-2009. According to governmental statistics agencies, unemployment rate rose to 12.6% in the second quarter of 2012. Social and economic justice has been achieved from the revolutionary demands. Price inflation rose to levels of 12% in the year of 2012. due to the surge of general food prices, levels not far from the Mubarak era rates. Food and beverages prices have rose up to 7.8% at the end of 2012 compared to the period in 2010. Inflation is expected to rise in 2013, and a proposed government plan for tax increase and cut in subsidy programs, which will lead to skyrocketing prices. During the last decade, Egyptians have suffered from the frequent unavailability of bread due to the wheat shortages and the low quality of wheat. The Kandil government, which is the current government of today, has continued to claim that the shortage problem is caused by corruption and bribery on the part of the bakers, but not blaming on the neoliberal policies that are imposed on Egypt. The composition of what's known as the National Salvation Front, which is the opposition to Morsi. It has been 2 months since the formation of the National Salvation Front against Morsi's dictatorial decree. The National Front includes liberals, leftists, centrists, Nasrists, which has been not cooperating front in its own entirety. More importantly, the front has been affiliated with a lot of former regime loyalists, directly or indirectly. Most notably, Amr Moussa, the former general of the Arab Union and former presidential candidate, is one of the figures of the Mubarak regime. Mohammed al-Baradi, the former IAEA chief, is considered a mouthpiece with little action and backed by the United States. Hadin Sabahi, a Nasrid, former presidential candidate, and who was an opponent to Mubarak, joined forces with the National Front. At the same time, there has been opposition within the front itself. Student members of 3 of the National Front founding parties, the Constitution Party, the Socialist Popular Alliance, and the Egyptian Popular Current, slammed the fronts for dealings with Mubarak-era parties and figures. They said, quote, "We refuse to see our party leaders stand side by side with the remnants of the former regime in the National Front," declared in a press statement. They continued to say, quote, "Members of the former regime have been always our enemies and the enemies of our revolution." Nevertheless, the National Front's affiliation with the former regime heads does not represent the grassroots organizing activists or revolutionaries. During the lead up to the referendum, the National Front could not establish a solid goal on whether to boycott or vote no in the referendum. Moreover, the National Front does not represent the vast majority of the opposition to Morsi either. Now, to look at Morsi's evaluation on the foreign policy part. The role of the United States has not changed, not even the mild manner. Today, large numbers of tear gas canisters were fired upon demonstrators in Tahrir Square, Alexandria, and the city of Suez. All canisters are written "Made in the United States," which means the military aid to Egypt has not ended or even been cut back. The United States supported Mubarak for the past 30 years for his dedication towards the security of the region for Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the alliance with the US military during the first Gulf War and the second one, and the submission to imperialist lines in the region. Moreover, Mubarak's tycoons and his sons played a critical role in privatizing Egypt's markets to foreign investors and multinational corporations. The Obama administration has been maneuvering throughout the past 2 years to make Egypt's stability a top priority. Clinton has been visiting Egypt over the course of the past 2 years, meeting with the military council and with the supreme guides, Muslim Brotherhood Mohammed Badia. The new relationship between the United States and the Muslim Brotherhood government and the Egyptian military has been redefined and resolidated with negotiations of a deal of 20 new F-16s. This was an outcome of the 28th Egyptian-US Joint Defense Committee meeting held in Cairo several weeks ago. The conclusion on the US side was, quote, "Egypt represents a cornerstone of this strategic vision, was probably the main factor in the success of the F-16 deal. The deal was finalized in December 11, 2012, during demonstrations that were against Morsi. This deal sent 3 clear messages by the United States. First, to Morsi, we support you. The second, to the Egyptian military, Morsi has our approval. And the last but not least, to the opposition, Morsi has our blessings. Morsi was under the test during the last Israeli assault on Gaza, and his passage with flying colors from the US standpoint. Hence, the US will come from different areas, including Congress and Senate, and the Muslim Brotherhood clearly understands the rules of the game. The rules of the game is maintaining the status quo of the geopolitical interests of the United States and Israel. In the first week of January, the Egyptian delegation was in Washington, D.C. for negotiation of expanding the qualifying industrial zone agreement with Israel and the United States. This meeting has been predecessed by another meeting in September of 2012 by a U.S. visit in Cairo. The agreement was a key item on Hisham Kandil's government since his appointment by Morsi. On September 19, 2012, Kandil stated to the economic news agency, Bloomingdale, that, quote, Egypt will meet its commitments to the agreement which opens up the US markets for Egyptian products if they a 10% Israeli component of added value, which Morsi's Egypt wants to reduce to 8%. He also added, quote, a lot of people are making good business off of this. We want to make sure that we do the right things for them to flourish, end quote. This is just the beginning of the story, with the Brotherhood having something else to say about this agreement in 2004. In December 2004, the Muslim Brotherhood held a block in the parliament during Mubarak they stated, quote, the QI, the Qualifying Industrial Zone, which is QIZ, agreement threatens Egypt's security. The Muslim Brotherhood ministers, PMs, stated that the agreement could be achieved. The agreement achieved all the enemies' goals that they sought for decades, which is controlling the regions economically through interfering into the Egyptian economy after it controlled it politically in the wake of the Camp David Agreement. And with the conclusion, quote, you cannot make peace or promise or agreement with the Zionists. Since 2011, January 25th's revolution, the volume of the QIZ exports increased, reaching $931.6 million in 2011, in comparison to $858.2 million in 2010. In the first quarter of 2012, Egypt's imports from Israel were about $94 million, and 48 million of which were made in March alone, which is 4 times as much as the same quarter in 2011. This is the main goal of the QRZ and the gas deal, to increase commerce between Egypt and Israel. In other words, the generation of money from importing goods from Israel is beneficial for the Egyptian economy as long as you don't rock the boat on US foreign policy. And since the Camp David Agreement has several articles that trade and normal state relations between the countries are mandatory. So the alliance between the military and the Muslim Brotherhood. President Morsi first consolidated his power with the removal of Field Marshal Tamtawi, Mubarak's defense minister, and the Army Chief of Staff Sami Anan. The justification for the removal was the attacks in Sinai in the summer of 2012 that left 16 Egyptians dead. Lieutenant General Abdel Fattah al-Sisi was named defense minister. Both Tamtawi and Anan were awarded honorary badges, like Salman mentioned earlier, and both Tamtawi and Anan are considered as presidential advisors on military matters. The removal also came with immunity for Tamtawi and Anan for their crimes committed in the so-called transitional period after Mubarak's departure. Hence, the military was, in a sense, neutralized and became a strong ally between the military heads and the Brotherhood. The military has a strong incentive to get immunities in the constitution within their institutions for their previous role under Mubarak. In the new constitution, Article 19.1 19:8 states that, quote, "Civilians shall not be stand trial before military courts except for crimes that harm the armed forces. The law should define such crimes and determine the accomplices of the military judiciary," end quote. In other words, the military can arrest, detain, try, and imprison civilians in military courts. Police brutality. Nearly 2 years after the initial Egyptian uprising, security forces have been responsible for the widespread brutality and have not yet been held accountable. A report published in October 2012 by Al-Nadim Center for Rehabilitation of Victims of Torture, citing over 247 cases of police brutality of Morsi's first 100 days in office. Deaths were mostly caused by live ammunition during the demonstrations and aside killings inside police stations, prisons, and public areas. Egyptian police were at least 88 cases of torture, 7 cases of sexual harassment, and 34 deaths. According to the report, at least 8 kidnappings of activists were politically motivated and were said to be tortured. Violence by security forces proceeded during the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, which took a year and a half after Mubarak, until Morsi took power as of June of 2012. Morsi, as the first elected civilian, has been widely criticized by activists and rights groups for his mild manner to confront the security apparatus. In fact, Morsi has not convicted or tried any officer or soldier for crimes in killing or torturing civilians. In 2011, under the military, the interior minister of the time retired 82 colonels and 505 generals, including 27 of them being accused of killing protesters, which is described as the biggest police reshuffle in history. In 2012, former Interior Minister Mohammed Ibrahim announced the ending of service of 454 major generals. In other words, Morsi is playing the reshuffling game of SCAF, which is promote deputies or middle-ranking officials into places of power who were part of the old regime, and moreover, Morsi could handpick any of his minister cabinets. So what are some lessons from the Egyptian revolution? From today's mass demonstrations, we learned that the revolution is a continuous process of mass participation, social reorganization, and awareness. The revolution of January 25th showed that mass mobilizations of working class people onto the streets to demand economic and social justice. Despite reshuffling of different institutions and figureheads, the fact remains that the people are not willing to go back home and sit silently while religion is used to protect corrupt officials. The revolutionary wave of Tunisia that went to Egypt and to other Arab countries has shown to the world that grassroots organizing and mass demonstrations do get results and change the trajectory of history. The lack of a revolutionary party and participation between political tendencies could speak the lack of the revolutionary change in Egypt. The Muslim Brotherhood, an organized political party, has taken power through the talks with the former regime, which only can be described as opportunists. The revolutionaries have mobilized, protest, marched, and organized on the defensive for the most part. And other parties, either well established before the revolution or established after the revolution, have shown to have difficulties of organizing Egypt due to the reshuffling of the old regime into a carbon copy into a new one. At the same time, a vast majority of the youth have been disenfranchised with the political parties that have either sold out the revolution or taken middle grounds, or ones that don't speak for revolutionary change. The reality is, in fact, remains on the streets of Egypt in the establishment of independent unions in the public and private sector, in solidarity with the Palestinian people, in grassroots organizing against the mass Egyptian media, in the continuous demands of bread, freedom, social justice, and retribution for the martyrs. Thank you.